Welcome back to The Left Field, the podcast where four friends discuss their fantasy Congress League and what the Democrats are up to from a leftist perspective. We're your hosts. I'm Luis Pagan.
I'm Alexi Jenkins.
I'm Chandana Bale.
And I'm Heman Chitande.
What's left, America?
What's left?
What's left?
I'm keeping that in.
I'm sorry I put that in there.
You know what's not left? Troops in Afghanistan.
Hey, we're out.
Ooh. We're out, baby.
Sovereignty for Afghanistan.
But you know, I hear the Cubans are begging for freedom.
We should invade.
And Haiti's without a president. I mean, the Caribbean has just gone crazy.
We haven't had these opportunities since the late 1890s.
Although, if you learn anything about the 1890s, we make our own opportunities.
So, Heman, what you got for us?
This week, I'm profiling Grace Meng for Representative Yea or Nay. Representative Yea or Nay is where we do a deep dive into a Democratic member of the House or Senate. We look into their background, prominent legislation, and where they stand on key progressive issues. Then we give them a yay or nay, depending on whether or not they're truly out there fighting for the people. So, Grace Meng of New York's 6th Congressional District, aka Queens, is a second-generational Chinese immigrant who's actually of Taiwanese descent. She was born in 1975 in Queens and has assumed office in 2009. She was the first member of the New York State Assembly from 22nd District. She was in office from 2009 to 2012. Then from 2013 onward, she was the House Representative, New York 6th District. And we'll get into the election a little bit towards the end of this. Then she's been vice chair of the Democratic National Committee since 2017 up until now. She's a graduate from the University of Michigan and studied law and is the founder of the Queens Chinese Women's Association. On the issues regarding education, she's more so on the side of reducing student loan debt, fighting to lower interest rates, making it easier to pay off as opposed to just a full-on forgiveness. A little bit more of a moderate stance there. She's also saved a college from going under in Queens way back in 2014. On energy and environment, she's pretty strong. She is on the Wilderness and Wildlife Protection Acts, more so than she is on a general Green New Deal, supports the Green New Deal. Most of her experiences involved in wilderness protection. For example, she's a co-sponsor of the America's Red Rock Wilderness Act, the Udall-Eisenhower Arctic Wilderness Act, both of which designate millions of acres as protected wildlife and wilderness. She also had a role in supporting a bill that instituted a moratorium on fracking, but that didn't go all the way through. So now she's watching that with a close eye. But she's also a co-sponsor of the Fresher Act, which is focused reduction of effluents and stormwater runoff through hydrofracking environmental regulation, which is HR 1175, and the Breathe Act, which is bringing reductions to energy's airborne toxic health effects act, HR 1154.
That is so excessive.
A lot of work to get those acronyms in. Damn.
Yeah, together, both of these bills basically were to bring domestic oil and gas exploration under the permitting systems established by the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts. So companies have to show that their projects conform to environmental regulations and be more transparent about the chemicals that they use. So she's pretty passionate about that side of things, which is like energy and environment. It seems like that's where she really shines here. Regarding immigration, she's not on the abolish ICE side, of course. She definitely seems a lot more moderate in this stance, but she's more so on the side of pathway to citizenship, reuniting children with their detained parents, eliminating the family visa backlog, requiring legal counsel for vulnerable immigrant populations, increasing judicial discretion, resolving issues considering the due process, and providing visas for a range of workers. That reflects the needs of our economy. So more so on the moderate side of immigration, if you will, but is still trying to be progressive in that case. She is a member of the Progressive Caucus as well. She's very strong on LGBTQ rights and is also very prominent in just human rights in general. A couple of the acts that she sponsored was HR 5, of course, Equality Act, Global Respect Act, International Human Rights Defense Act, Every Child Deserves a Family Act, and then the Elder Pride Act and so forth. So pretty strong LGBTQ rights. She's an original co-sponsor of Medicare for All and a founding member of Medicare for All Caucus. She does support a public option, Medicare buy-in, and lowering the Medicare age as well. Pretty strong on healthcare, environment, and relatively strong on immigration and education, though not so much so as left as I would like her to be. On abortion, she's pretty good. Definitely pro-choice on abortion. She's got a 92% rating by the NAPO, which is indicating a tough on crime stance.
Oh.
Yeah. In terms of voter rights, she doesn't think that you need photo IDs to vote because they suppress the vote, which I think is good, especially going in hand in hand with her immigration stance there. And then she wants to establish a My Voice voucher, which is small campaign contributions, where it's you get a voucher to go donate to a political candidate. And then she's also for the statehood for the District of Columbia. Gun control, of course, she wants micro stamping and more background checks, which is good. She supports restrictions on gun purchases and ban large capacity ammunition. That's mainly her record. So she ran to succeed her father originally. So she's like an incumbent political dynasty almost. So she was taken off the ballot originally when the Democrat Ellen Young challenged her residency status, and then eventually her district issues were resolved. She succeeded her father in 2007 of January because her father pleaded guilty to wire fraud with connections to bribery to the tune of about $80,000. So Young basically took over in 2007, and then she challenged Young again in 2008. 59 to 41%, she won the primary, and then she won again in the November election, but as an independent party nominee. And then in 2010 she was reelected unopposed. But it's that's like the worst scandal that I saw from her, which is mainly her father.
Did you mention that she also strongly opposes the Iran nuclear deal?
No.
I was thinking about putting her on my team. That was one of the reasons why I didn't. She also apparently got robbed in 2013. Someone stole her Gucci bag.
I didn't even know if I wanted to mention that, right? Because I'm like, yikes, that just sucks. And now it's like a news story.
That just really wrinkles my class consciousness. Designer bags just get me.
The Gucci bag was why I didn't pick her.
I just don't know how you're running around with your Gucci tote bag and being a part of the blue collar caucus.
There's a lot of rich people in the progressive caucus, I'll say that.
Yeah, that's the thing too. It's like they're all rich. So I don't want to single her out. I actually really do want to single her out because I think designer stuff is really shitty. But I don't want to single her out specifically because we know she had a designer handbag. A lot of those white men who don't get attention in Congress definitely have Rolexes.
Yeah.
Nobody's talking about it though.
Cufflinks or some shit.
She also suffered injuries to her head, her left knee, her hand, and her face.
Wow, that's awful. That's really interesting that she was a victim of a violent crime. And I wonder if that has informed her stances on crime at all. And if she's changed her positions from before 2013 to the present. It's not super surprising to have a Democrat who is quote unquote tough on crime. It still does seem kind of out of step with how progressive her other positions are.
Do we have more details on our tough on crime stance?
My yay or nay depends on the outcome of this issue.
I know.
Do we know if she voted for the George Floyd bill? Not that that's like a big marker or anything.
Really kind of isn't.
I mean, if she didn't, then she isn't even in favor of reforming.
Meng votes to pass the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. This was on June 25th of last year.
She was also a co-sponsor. There were 99 co-sponsors, but as we'll get into more later, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is not where I would like to be on criminal justice by any means.
Yeah.
However, I do think for me, this fact does save Grace Meng from a nay because she's not perfect on any issue, but she's not bad necessarily on any issue from what we can discern because she's kind of half in with all of the progressive issues that we care about. That's just going to scrape her by for me. So I'm going to yay her.
Yeah, we're going to watch out for any bribery charges in the future. But
Exactly.
I think it's a yay for me too.
The legislation she sponsored on the environment. I don't know. I think she's a yes for me as well.
If the good outweighs her fashion taste, let's say, to put it nicely, then I'm good with that. She's a yay for me as well.
For me, the only reason that her father's bribery charges are relevant in my analysis of her is because she did assume the seat after him, not immediately after him, but it was that sort of dynastic succession that always kind of reeks a little bit of unfairness. So it's nothing tangible, but it is definitely a little questionable.
There's nothing where I'm like, yikes, that's terrible on her record.
It's like a lukewarm yay. Today, I want to talk about HR 4194, which is the People's Response Act. So this act was sponsored by Representative Cori Bush, a Democrat from Missouri. There are a decent amount of co-sponsors on this bill, but not a ton. There are 23 in total, and there are some noteworthy progressive names on that list. Ayanna Pressley, Pramila Jayapal, Mondaire Jones, Sheila Jackson Lee, Eleanor Norton Holmes, Rashida Tlaib, Ro Khanna, Ilhan Omar, AOC, and Jamal Bowman are among the co-sponsors of this bill, along with Cori Bush. Current status, it was introduced in the House on June 28th, 2021, and hasn't progressed too far since then. It's currently sitting in 5 different committees in the House, and it has not been introduced in the Senate. In essence, the People's Response Act's major contribution, if passed, would be to reconceptualize public safety as an issue of public health rather than as solely an issue of crime and punishment. So the bill would do this by creating a public safety agency within the Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS. Currently, public safety is dealt with solely by the Department of Justice, and HHS isn't involved in public safety at all. So the new HHS agency that the bill would create would then be tasked with providing grants for state and local organizations to develop and pilot community-based public safety programs. So the goal of these grants specifically is to develop alternatives to incarceration, and the programs are supposed to focus on providing people with care and services to fix problems within communities rather than outsourcing people to state or federal prisons to be locked up. So the programs would need to be non-carceral and health-centered in order to be funded under this bill. Potential services that the community-based programs could provide include vouchers for supportive housing, community-based employment programs, violence interruption, harm reduction counseling services, school mediation, and treatment for mental health and substance abuse. In addition to this grant program, the bill would also provide a first responders hiring grant, and that would invest in hiring first responders who are not police officers. So this group would include licensed social workers, mental health counselors, substance use counselors, and peer counselors. A major goal of this legislation and this component of the legislation is to limit citizens' encounters with the police in order to curb police violence against people of color and people experiencing mental health crises. The bill would also include dedicated grants for violence prevention efforts while incentivizing state and local governments to shrink their criminal legal systems. Rep. Bush said, quote, "This act brings together a broad coalition of health professionals, advocates, teachers, mental health professionals, peers, counselors, social workers, and movement leaders to build an agency that is rooted in a holistic approach to public safety." The bill is supported by at least 85 advocacy groups, including the ACLU, Greenpeace, Human Rights Watch, Black Lives Matter, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and the National Immigration Project. One of the really noteworthy things about this bill, as you might have caught on already, is that it's really the first step in an actual piece of defunding the police legislation. Bush said specifically that the bill would meet some of the demands of the movement to defund the police. So that's definitely one of her goals in putting forward this piece of legislation. As I'm sure everyone remembers, the defund the police movement became a political flashpoint last year during the George Floyd protests. The idea of defunding the police has actually been around much longer than since 2020. Primarily, it was conceptualized and put forward in the works of scholars and activists like Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and Mariam Kaba. One thing I think is really important to talk about when we're talking about this bill and its effects is what defund the police actually means. This is something that's been hotly debated both by Republicans, but also really importantly between Democrats. And it's something that has caused a lot of contention amongst the progressive wing of the party and the more moderate neoliberal wing of the party. So I wanted to spend some time digging into what the phrase actually means and what it's actually calling for, especially since it is one of our main policy positions that we look for when evaluating progressive reps in Rep Yay or Nay. Defund the police really has two components to it. And I think this is especially important to highlight since the media and mainstream political discourse tends to focus on the first of these components and leave out the second. So the first component is the component of literally stripping police departments of funding and hopefully at the end of the day, abolishing those departments. Taken alone, this demand often triggers white middle-class panic about being left at the mercy of quote unquote criminals without any government protection. And there are definitely racial and class overtones of this panic, but there are also some really legitimate fears here because in the abstract, the idea of absolutely zero government response and accountability to the threat of murder and assault is very scary. I think that we can recognize that, but that's actually not what defund the police imagines to be the case. And that's where the second component of defund the police comes in. This takes a sharp ideological divergence from our mainstream ideas of crime and criminality at a very baseline level. The popular conception of crime is that some people are inherently, quote, bad and some people are inherently good. Criminals are kind of seen as an entirely separate class of people. They're fundamentally flawed and therefore they must be punished and cannot be rehabilitated. And this just isn't true. It's rooted in a very Christian black and white ethic about the world that has really permeated our legal system and our criminal legal system in particular. So there have been a lot of sociological studies to show that this isn't really the case. People, in addition to case studies, people are a lot more complex than just good or bad. No one is just one thing. I really believe that nobody is inherently the worst thing that they've ever done. Instead of people being inherently good or inherently evil, crime is actually caused by poverty, addiction, mental health issues, etc. Based on this understanding, Defund the Police imagines a more realistic approach to crime based on data and how the world actually works rather than Christian ideas of good and evil. So the second component of Defund the Police is dealing with the underlying causes of crime by funding necessary services for people and having mental health and substance abuse professionals ready to respond to crimes rather than the police. That funding that goes to the police would then go instead to these agencies that are actually able to be responsive to the problems that communities are facing. Defund the Police is also responsive to the reality that police don't actually solve any crimes. They spend most of their time responding to noise complaints, issuing parking and traffic citations, and dealing with non-criminal issues. And the vast majority of police officers actually only make one felony arrest per year. According to the FBI's official crime data, law enforcement solved fewer than half of all violent crimes and only 18% of property crimes in 2017. This is the latest report put out by the FBI, and the link will be in the description of this episode. The word solved is also doing a lot of work here because by the FBI's count, solved means in this context, the suspect was a suspect, not necessarily the person who did it, was arrested, charged, and the case was handed over to prosecutors. The word solved in this context also covers cases where the suspect dies prior to arrest or the victim does not cooperate with the prosecution. I think a really salient example of this is if someone comes forward saying that they were raped or they were sexually assaulted, and then later they don't want to go forward with the case for many of the obvious reasons that going forward with a rape or sexual assault case can be incredibly traumatizing to people, then that is considered a solved case if they just walk away from it. With those qualifications in mind, I want to go back to the fact that under that metric, law enforcement solved fewer than half of all violent crimes, with that being the definition of solved, and only 18% of property crimes.
Jesus.
Wow.
So at the same time, cops also commit a lot of crimes. And in 2020, we really got a front row look at this. That year, there were 1,021 fatal police shootings. And during the first 6 months of 2021, 440 citizens have been fatally shot by the police as of July 1st of this year. Between 2005 and 2013, police officers were charged with 405 forcible rapes and 636 counts of forcible fondling. And this is just the data that we have about sexual assaults by police officers, which is one of the most notoriously underreported crimes, especially when the perpetrator is the police. And there are also no comprehensive statistics on crimes by police officers, and there's no government entity that tracks data on the police who were arrested. No one in our government is keeping track of this. So we don't even have accurate numbers. Those are only the ones we know for sure. According to an investigation by the Washington Post, more than a quarter of all people killed by the police since 2015 have had a known mental illness. And the same report found that Black Americans are twice as likely to be killed by the police than white Americans. So Rep. Bush's bill is responsive to both these realities and trying to prevent these killings and close these disparities. I think this is really important to highlight because it shows that the work of police officers could easily be done with much less risk to citizens' privacy, freedom, and safety by unarmed traffic enforcement personnel, social services personnel, and even in the most extreme cases of violent crime, like serial killings and things that rarely ever happen, you could have a highly specialized detective unit dealing with that. There's no need for us to have this expansive, heavily armed, militarized cabal dealing with all these issues that they have been proven to not be very good at dealing with, and to actually cause citizens to have their lives at risk and their bodily autonomy at risk. Doesn't even get into the Fourth Amendment violations that the cops commit. Defund the Police's stance on crime isn't that crime is not a problem, as the right typically presents it. or that people should be left to fend for themselves. It's actually a statement that reflects a more modern understanding of what actually makes us safer and puts that understanding into action. Unfortunately, this idea is still highly debated within the Democratic Party. So in June 2020, during the George Floyd protests and the presidential campaign, Joe Biden actually wrote an op-ed that will also be linked in the description, saying that he actually wanted to increase funding to the police by $300 million. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which we talked about earlier in the episode, if signed into law, would also increase funding to the police and institute reforms rather than defund the police departments. I also want to point out the fact that the idea of defunding the police is presented as a very radical policy position by the mainstream of the party, but Republicans defund things all the time, and no one makes a big deal out of it at all. So in 1981, Reagan actually tried to abolish the Department of Education. Luckily, he was unsuccessful, but that was one of the things that helped him win the election in 1980, and it wasn't presented as this radical thing. During the mid-2000s, top Republican politicians, including Newt Gingrich and Michelle Bachmann, tried to defund the EPA. So attempting to abolish or completely defund government agencies is not something that isn't discussed in our politics. It's actually a frequent Republican rallying cry. So it's really ironic that defund the police is presented as such a radical leftist idea when defunding agencies is quite literally one of the pillars of the Republican Party, including defunding public schools. Republicans are responsible for very deep cuts, but we're never saying that they're so radical for defunding education or for defunding public libraries. That charge is only leveraged at the left. I want to talk about the scope of Rep. Bush's proposed solution because I think that's really important to conceptualize what these numbers actually mean and whether this is a drop in the bucket or something truly transformative. The bill actually would spend quite a bit more money than I expected. It would spend $10 billion over a 4-year period from 2022 to 2026. $2.5 billion each would go to the federal government, state governments, and local governments as groups. So that's 3 payments of $2.5 billion. And each of these groups would be in charge of administering the community safety grant, which is the first part of the bill that we talked about, to community-led organizations. The remaining $2.5 billion would go to the Secretary of HHS to administer to community-based organizations, health departments, states, local governments, and tribal governments too, to fund hiring of non-police first responders on all of those levels of government. So I wanted to take a step back and talk about the history of policing in the US more broadly. Policing originally emerged as slave patrols in the 1700s and the 1800s in the South that were formed with the sole purpose of catching and returning enslaved people who escaped to their enslavers. The first municipal police department in the North was used to quash labor riots and protect the interests of the rich. These were two twin purposes of class enforcement and racial enforcement that continued in the main goals of the police ever since. So in modern politics, both Republicans and Democrats have been quote unquote tough on crime. This really started in mainstream American politics with Nixon's war on drugs, and it continues to this day to be very popular, as we just saw with Grace Meng. President Clinton famously signed into law the 1994 crime bill, which is now credited with largely creating our current crisis of mass incarceration. This bill implemented mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines that resulted in more people being locked up for longer periods of time, as well as increased funding for the police. This infamous bill was the pet project of then Senator Joe Biden, who was its primary sponsor and who has kind of recognized that his past tough on crime stances were harmful, but also kind of not. For example, in his 2017 memoir, he touted the fact that the bill helped put an additional 100,000 police officers in the streets. In 2016, he also said that he was, quote unquote, not at all ashamed of his role in supporting the bill and that it, quote unquote, restored American cities. So it was only after he started thinking about running for president that he really expressed any regret over the bill. Biden in the 90s also championed cracking down on children who were truants or runaways and punishing them in the adult criminal legal system. On average, the US spends about $340 per person per year on public policing, which is a total of $193 billion in spending every year. So comparing that to the scope of Rep. Bush's bill, it's clear that that's not enough to do all of the lifting that our quote unquote public safety infrastructure is doing now. So her bill was a $10 billion allocation over 4 years, and the current police budget is $193 billion every year. I mean, just imagine how much better our worlds could be if we spent that $193 billion on our people. Anyway, so that's about $192,940 per every individual police officer. And that actually includes part-time workers in addition to full-time workers. So police departments are funded through a combination of local public funds, federal grants, fines and fees, forfeitures, which is when they just take stuff from people that they arrest, and there really is no way to get it back. They can kind of just take your stuff. And also from private donations, which I find pretty problematic. So federal grants come from a couple of government departments. So the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security for counterterrorism purposes, the Department of Agriculture for infrastructure for rural police departments, and infamously, the Department of Defense, which provides surplus military equipment for our local police departments. So not only is it the $193 billion of annual funding that police are getting allocated, the military is also being used as a pass-through. So we're spending a massive proportion of our budget on military spending, and a lot of their equipment just gets funneled down to polices. So stuff that was designed to be used in a war zone is then used in our streets. Police purportedly work for the community, but only 1% of police departments are currently subject to community oversight.
Holy shit. Who watches The Watchmen? What the hell?
No one watches them. I also wanted to talk about the history of congressional action on the issue. This has been a debate amongst Democrats as to whether the police should be abolished or reformed. And so I wanted to lay out the case for why reform really does not work. And there's a lot of historical evidence for this. So police abuses have been quote unquote discovered at many points throughout history, which then leads to institutional reforms, which then don't fix the problem, and it has to get rediscovered 30 to 50 years later. So the first time this happened was in 1894. That was the first major investigation of police misconduct that took place in New York City. It was called the Lennox Committee, and it was in response to police clubbings of citizens. And this is 1894. In 1931, the Wickersham Commission examined brutal prohibitionist enforcement by the police, and they found evidence of brutal interrogation strategies that were used on American citizens. In 1967, the Kerner Commission found that police actions were the precipitating incident before an outbreak of violence in half of the instances of public disorder examined by the commission. It recommended strengthening the ties between police and the communities they were policing and ensuring proper police conduct in, quote unquote, the ghetto. This happened again in 1991 after the police beating of Rodney King and the resultant protests. After the killing of Michael Brown and Eric Garner, the Obama administration's President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing resulted in reforms like implicit bias training, police community listening sessions, changes in use of force policies, and systems to identify potentially problematic officers early on. So these were all instances of police violence against citizens, which led to wide-scale protests, which led to a commission delivering a report that led to reforms that did not fix the problem. If reforming worked, we would have been done with this issue in 1894, but it doesn't. So we're stuck in this perpetual cycle of forgetting that the police are inherently brutal, having them brutalize the citizen, and then going through the process of arguing about reforms all over again. It's a cycle that continues over and over again because it doesn't address the underlying issue, which is the fact that the police are based on an enforcement of racial hierarchy and class hierarchy in a brutal and dominance-based fashion that doesn't treat people with dignity, and communities are only harmed more by the presence of the police. With all that history in mind, I think that Rep. Bush's bill is a very important step. I was pretty saddened in my research for this, because there's been almost no major reporting on this defund the police bill that actually puts forward a tangible example of alternatives to the police and what defund the police means in a real and authentic way. There was no reporting from any of the major outlets, including the New York Times. Meanwhile, I found a bunch of articles about hand-wringing about how the phrase defund the police was losing moderate Democrats elections because it was so scary, but literally nothing in their reporting correcting the misassumption put forward by Fox News of what defund the police actually means. It's definitely an uphill battle, and I wanted to include all of Biden's history with crime, the police, and the criminal legal system, because I think it's a testament to the fact that he's never going to sign this and it's not going to get passed. And that's really sad. But I think we really need to have these discussions because most people aren't aware of all of this history. And most people aren't aware that any alternative system exists to the horrible, brutal system that we've set up. That's the People's Response Act.
I like it. I think it's a very, very good step in the right direction.
I really do like that she is addressing that segment of police violence that is specific towards individuals with mental illness. Because I feel like that case for HHS to take on those instances just makes so much sense.
They're the obvious things that fall under public safety, like mental health and substance abuse. But things like domestic violence are things that we don't think of as public safety issues, but they really are. Domestic violence is such a health issue, and it is such a mental health issue because so much of the abuse is mental and depends on abusers perpetuating their own trauma and then also traumatizing their victims in a way that makes it impossible to leave. And the police are the ones who are tasked with dealing with the situation. And I've had so many instances where my clients who were abused by their husbands would call the police in really horrible circumstances, and the police would just totally write it off and be like, oh, it's just a domestic dispute. It doesn't matter. This has never happened with any of my clients specifically, but there have been a ton of cases where the police will actually bond with the perpetrator and joke with him and be like, oh, I understand this. Like, I get mad at my wife too. That makes sense. So the police are so horribly inequipped to deal with this issue. And it's just going undealt with. A ton of people are getting murdered by their intimate partners, and it's almost an invisible issue in the US because our systems are so incompetent dealing with it.
Yeah, that's a great point. I do think that there's like a big pie to like slice off and like reimagine. And I think this is a slice. I don't think this is the whole pie, but I think it's a very important slice. Hopefully this comes to some sort of a vote.
It won't.
It's too far left for our current Congress.
It's too big of a challenge to the order of dominance and hierarchy in our society.
And policing is definitely a thing that has gained power across centuries. I mean, people forget that back in the 19th century, the point of a sheriff was to serve summons, and do things like this. They weren't really involved in the everyday lives of people. And the people that imagined modern policing didn't imagine traffic cops being a thing. They imagined a completely separate entity handling the sort of day-to-day things, with detectives handling actual police work, what was conceived as original police work. And so we've just started tacking on all of these responsibilities onto people who cannot be experts in all of them. They cannot all be lawyers. They cannot all be mental health experts. And so we shouldn't ask them to be, and we should allocate our funds accordingly so we have expertise in each of these fields.
And they're not required to be experts in anything.
That's the other thing. They're not required to be an expert in anything at all.
I took a whole class on Fourth Amendment law at Harvard Law, and it was so incredibly complicated, so confusing, and so complex. And you can be a Harvard Law student and study super hard and still be immensely confused by it because it's immensely confusing. But these are the laws that the police are supposed to go out every day and enforce. And what the result of that is that the police take all the power because people don't know their rights. I don't even know their rights. And I was literally trained in this. It's a creation of the Supreme Court that's intentionally complex to use the police as a tool of oppression.
All readings of the Fourth Amendment have been made to the benefit of the police in the past, so that they themselves believe they have the ultimate power over this. They've never been told no. So,
well, one time there was one good period of the Supreme Court, and that is in the 50s during the Warren Court when we got Miranda rights. That was the only time the court was ever good. I mean, cars are not included under persons, places, and effects in the Constitution because the Supreme Court decided that they were a lower expectation of privacy.
Wow.
Arbitrarily.
Add to that's the number one way that people come into contact with the police, and that 20% of killings begin with a car stop. with being stopped by a police car.
And a lot of times it's just a pretext because the police want to stop the person. Because there's so many laws that you have to comply with. They can always find something. And if they can't find something, they can make it up. And that's totally fine under Supreme Court doctrine. I mean, look at Sandra Bland. It was like a registration issue and she ended up dead.
I mean, they're just class enforcers. Thanks for listening to this episode of Left Field. If you're looking for more leftist takedowns of the current order, or to find out more of what's left of America, you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Send us any comments or suggestions to leftfieldpoliticspod@gmail.com and find us on Instagram at leftfieldpolitics. Until next time, lefties.